I don't know, I think a certain kind of radical compassion is the only thing that's going to like ultimately start to mend us. It feels like things get so splintered and so argumentative that I sort of start to look at this lens of that level of compassion where you can say it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done, and I mean that literally. I'm going to see the human being in you.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 93rd episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and you can find all of this at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page where supporters can join at tiers that start at just $1 a month, and that helps keep us bringing you printmaking content every week. You can also get thank yous like stickers, prints, and mugs, as well as access to bonus content, Shop Talk, with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. These are quick and dirty tips and tricks with our guests from materials, processes, business advice, and just general studio nonsense. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, but are on the fence about it, check out the link in the show notes and hear Tim's chat with today's guest for completely free, no sign up, no sign in required. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. This episode of Pine Copper Lime is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your practice since 1997. If you've been following them along on Instagram, and we really do recommend that you do, you've no doubt seen their newest initiative in the print world, Speedball's Print Posse. Working with artists like Florence Guedes, they have created a brand new line of custom printing inks and additives to push your practice even further. So head on over to Speedball's Print Posse shop at speedballart.com and find out where you can pick up a can of your new favorite color. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Caledonia Curry, an interdisciplinary artist and printmaker based in New York, who you might know a little bit better by her other name, Swoon. I spoke to Callie a couple weeks ago while she was in the middle of preparing for her new exhibition, Swoon, Wholeness in Mind, which is open now and on exhibition through the 11th of July at the Turner Carroll Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In this episode, we talk about giving kids encouragement to their endeavors, how there is so much more to printmaking than editioning, using that detailed process to printmaking to free up your practice, community projects, and trauma healing through art making. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to find radical compassion with Caledonia Curry. Hi, Callie. How's it going?
Hi, Miranda. I'm great. How are you?
I'm really good. I'm so pleased that we're finally getting to sit down and have a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So just to get started, I always invite my guests to introduce themselves just briefly by answering the questions who you are, where you are, and how you describe what it is that you do.
Okay.
So it's just small questions, yeah.
Yeah. So my name is Caledonia Curry, and I'm in Brooklyn right now. And I am an interdisciplinary artist. I've never actually used that term before, but I was like, shit, how do I say? My practice is pretty widespread. You know, it definitely has some big keystones, but I do a lot of different kinds of things. And so that can be a little tricky to describe sometimes. So how about we'll just call it interdisciplinary for now.
Perfect. Well, we'll definitely get into the different branches of it for sure in this hour. So as I was doing some research for this episode, I noticed a lot of the time when people talk about your work, it seems to start in 1999 in the Bowery, you know, with these Louise Pace-ups that sort of first drew the attention of the art world writ large. And, you know, a lot of the imagery in that and the aesthetic really sort of travels through to what you do today in a lot of ways. So you already at that young age had this really developed distinctive aesthetic. But I know that art practices tend not to kind of fall from on high, fully formed, right? So if you don't mind, I'd like to maybe go back a little further. And if you could tell a bit of the story of how you came to find that voice in that time between, you know, kind of childhood or even in childhood and then till coming to New York.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I, like many artists, I was an artist since I was a kid, but I did have a kind of a big defining moment or couple of moments where I got involved in art classes that just helped me like tremendously. They were like these phase change moments. And the first one was like with kind of a Bob Ross style, like retirees painting class. And everybody was 80 and I was 10, and it was like very adorable. And it was this sort of magical thing where they gave me this toolbox that I just like took off with. And it's like that moment for me is such a good lesson in what happens when you just like give confidence to a kid, like actually maybe more than was deserved at that moment, but then I made good on it, you know? And then I continued to study painting. I when I was 12, then I started to take classes with a person who was like a realist painter. And he actually still teaches in Florida. And what's wonderful is I was down in Florida working on a project, and one of the like incredible creative people who was back in town because of COVID and ended up helping on the project, they also studied with the same painting teacher when they were a kid. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. And so, yeah, he was just somebody that really taught kids how to see. And I have this like memory of drawing like from a photograph of like a driveway, and I just tried to draw it straight down like towards the eye, and he was like held up the pencil and was like, look, it doesn't look like what you think it looks like. And that was just like a world changer for me. I was like, what? Not only does it not look like what I think it looks like, but I can figure it out. I can sort of learn to see, which was like wild. I mean, you think you know. And then I was like, that was my identity, as I was this classical painter. And then I was like this, experimenter, but I was always very much a painter. And I remember like trying block printing in high school and being like, this is the worst thing. I hate this more than anything. I hated it so much because I was a painter, right? So I was like shading and all my colors. And then suddenly somebody's like, take this knife and like hack up this thing and you get 2 tries and 2 colors. And I was like, death to this thing. This is the worst thing. But then, then I moved to New York and I was painting, and I, it was like this thing where I was a kid pre-internet, a teenager pre-internet even. Yeah. So like when I got to New York, there was all this stuff about what art could be that I'd never even heard of and never even been exposed to. Not to mention that the city is like an artwork, and I was just totally blown away and felt everything shifted under my feet. And I was like, wait a minute, like art isn't like a square painting on a wall only, it can be, but what if it wants to also be other things? It was very destabilizing.
I can imagine.
And then I got, really fixated on thinking about like, well, what are the other ways that it can show up? And like Richard Serra had this sculpture. Well, PS1 was like an amazing space, and people had all this kind of decentralized art where it would be like somebody would have like a dot that like followed through the building, and you'd be like, wait, this is an art piece? And Richard Serra had this like sculpture that was molten lead in the corner, and I just had never seen anything like that. I had never had that proposed to me, that this is what an artwork could be. And so it just did such a big shift, and I started to just say like, well, what would my artwork look like if I tried to like allow it to shift a little? But I was so rooted in portraiture. I had such a classical background that I would sort of return to this feeling of like, but I'm still me, which is this person who can look at a human face for infinity of time and who, has this training. And so I kept like kind of wrestling back and forth between being like, oh my God, I'm obsessed with graffiti. And then being like, well, I'm not going to pick up a spray can and like start tagging. I want to still be who I am. I'm not trying to become someone else. I just want to learn how to interact with this thing that I love so much. And that was when this kind of back and forth started. And I landed on printmaking in there, because sort of two things: the simplicity, because you could read it at a distance, and that seemed important in the cityscape, and then the other was the repeatability, that I wanted to be able to, these things are going to be semi-permanent. It's nice to make more than one, but kind of more than that, I really wanted the feeling that I was creating a language with these, like each little print was going to be, sort of a syllable in a sentence. And I was going to build from there, doing the repetition and the changing, and the way that, printmaking, editioning is such a small aspect of printmaking. There's this kind of whole other world that's about same with variation, same with variation, same with variation. And that's where I really kind of nerd out.
Yeah. And can you speak maybe a little more to what you said about creating a language? Because that sounds really interesting. But I don't think I quite understood what you meant by that.
Well, I think I was thinking of it kind of literally, almost like I had this sense that there was like a syntax, or like that, when we say words, we're like, what, or, duh. There's pieces to it. It's and you use those things over and over again. What goes into water? What, we're using these sounds, and we're using these forms, and it's pretty simple. And then we construct this whole world out of it. And so I was like, I could create 26 things. I could create, and I think there were people like Xu Bing was like creating his own kind of fake language and characters at the time. Certainly there were other people that were thinking about language. And so, I just had this feeling where I was like, I'm going to just take, visual images, drawings, but I was doing little square linoleum block prints at the time. And I just was like, what will it feel like for me if I build these up and reconfigure them and make these long scrolls and kind of try to build these like landscape, build a sentence, or build a paragraph, or, interact with different kind of shapes in the city using these like same forms repeated over and over again. And will that start to feel like a language if I do that?
And did you find that it did?
I think what I found is that I was developing my voice.
Yeah.
No one ever said like, is that a language? Or is that a sentence? Like, certainly not. That was my private thought process. But I certainly found that I was developing my voice. And the other reason that I knew that I was developing my voice, it was like quite a magical, mystical time, to be honest, because I think up until that point, I was always being like, okay, here's my, Van Gogh painting. Here's my, surrealist painting. I was always kind of like knew what I was referencing. And suddenly there was this feeling almost like the lights were out. And I was like, okay, just walk. Like take one step, take the next step. And there was this feeling of being very much in the dark, and this feeling that I stripped back everything I knew, because, I'm back to linoleum block print. So I'm with these two colors, these very harsh forms. And it was like being like, here's your bones. You have these very simple blocks. You don't know where you're going. This is all you get. Go.
Wow.
And it felt really magical. I was like, something is happening. I could feel it, and I think that's what it feels like, or that's what it felt like for me at the moment when you start to develop your own voice rather than, be just rooted in your learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I can identify with that feeling of realizing that like you've kind of walked off the edge of the cliff, but you didn't fall straight down. You get to be like, you kind of get to be Wile E. Coyote, where you're like, wait a minute, I'm not holding on to anything anymore.
Yes.
But everything hasn't come crashing down,
Yes. Yeah. Like when the older kids like trick you into riding a bike.
Yeah, exactly.
When they just stop holding on, they don't tell you, and you're like, "What's happening?"
Right? Yeah. Yes.
Oh, I'm doing this.
Exactly, but with the creative process, and then you realize that it's just you, and you have to crash a few times, and then I feel like it's a metaphor you could definitely keep going with. Yeah.
Totally. Including that I knew that a lot of my work at the time was not good, and I continued to put it out. Because I was like, well, I don't see another way. Like I'm not making better work, but I know I will make better work. Mm-hmm. So it was like the only way through is through.
Yes.
And I think speaking of crashing, also sometimes there's periods of just being like, this is weird, but like, what do you want from me? Like, this is what's happening. Like, I can't avoid this. I can't get to the next step unless I cross through this step.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a guest once say, you have a lot of bad prints in you and you just need to get them out. And I always love that.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I love that. That is so good. And let me tell you what, pasting things out in the street and letting them just rot off the wall is a great way to get them out.
I can imagine.
Just get a lot of them out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, they kind of can, return to the, the cosmic ether from whence they came. Yeah, as they like flow back into the earth. Absolutely. So speaking of sort of the ways in which printmaking continued to interact with your practice and still does, we see a lot of repeating figures, a lot of repeating imagery in your work sort of throughout the years, throughout the installations. Tarantula Mother, the Ice Queen, Moni, these figures appear again. And while I know some of them are relief coloring and a lot of them are actually just, re-hand drawn as well, I've always been curious if this, having early on been exposed to printmaking and the reproductive capabilities, if you think that kind of influenced the reoccurring visual themes, or would they have been there all along? Chicken and egg? What do you think?
Well, a lot of when I make a carving, I will let that, I'll make mini prints off the initial block, but then I'll also make silk screens, sometimes even etchings, that same image, the literal same image, I will rework in a few different ways. And so that might be like when you sort of see something cross a medium, then I'm sometimes going, okay, I'm going to take this print and like redevelop it in etching, and it's be like a photoplate etching or something like that. So I think a lot of the recurring image is just that kind of original fascination of mine of like of same with change, of being like, I always had this kind of image of like, this is how evolution works, is that you make hundreds of something and each one is a little different, and you just feel that out. You fill out all the possibilities. You're like, wow, what happens when I break this up and make it three-dimensional? What happens when I leave this really raw? What about this color variation, that color variation, that color variation? Just getting, building up all the possibilities. And I will often feel, like when I first make a print, the first couple things I do with it are very, rudimentary. Like I would almost, it would feel like a loss if I had stopped there in terms of working that image. That like right now I'm making this huge, sculptural box that's like in the shape, it's like round with all these kind of compartments, and it's just this like very epic wall piece, and I'm making it out of a print that I first pulled 6 years ago. So it's a long time that I've been working with this image, and I just now got to the place where I could really explode it out in this very intense way. And I feel like part of that ability to do that is just getting super, super comfortable with this image of being like, the image becomes a material, like a material that I can use and work with, like and kind of deform and shift or figure out the best, most precise way to sort of like honor the forms. And so, yeah, I love to have a kind of a whole arc of a relationship with each one of the portraits.
That's such a fascinating idea where you're touching on that idea of image as material, that you can get to know it as a player the way you would, if you were suddenly taking on ceramics or something. And that the same way that the media that we use will always kind of end up having its own voice in the finished outcome. When you spend time with that images, it sounds like the portraits get to have that effect as well, which is fascinating.
Yes. That you're so comfortable with them that you're like, oh, I'm going to use it in this way. I'm going to rip it in half. I'm going to, all these different things that I think that you wouldn't do if you were just like, here's my painting. Here's my one precious, version of this, right? That it's so much about exploration and variation and change.
Yeah, that was something that I think that we chatted about before, was just this idea of with printmaking, you don't need to be precious. And so you can just dive deep and follow whatever rabbit hole that you have no faith in, like just to see if maybe there's a jewel at the end of it.
Totally.
And if it doesn't turn out, you can start again, which is such an amazing thing. So you just can
and you still have your core image, you return to that. And And I love, for me, it also does a thing where it balances my need to be ultra precise with my need to be experimental, because I can pour all the ultra precise energy into that portrait. When I draw the portraits in printmaking, although I actually have put a pause on my printmaking practice. So I'm talking about this kind of in the past tense, but I would take a day, they would take a month at least to draw and carve. And then a couple of days of that would just be zoning into the face, where you like turn off your phone and you just get away and you're just in this. And so that kind of energy where you're like, no mistakes can happen. This is the place. That's also there, but that's what's locked in to the print. And then once you have that and it's kind of locked in, then you can start messing around. And I love that, because it allows me to show up as the kind of like wild perfectionist that I am, while also expressing an experimental, like kind of, readiness to kind of recreate and destroy the material as well.
Yeah. I've never heard it talked about that way, but it's so true that you can kind of imbue an image with this sort of fiddliness, with the perstickety perfectionist elements of it. But then on the other side of it, you just get to kind of reap that benefit while, destroying it or wheat pasting it and, knowing that someone's going to come tag it or something in a minute and it won't have that life. That's a real sort of freedom, isn't it?
Yeah, because you wouldn't, like, when I think about like pouring a month of love and energy into something, it would be so much harder to be like, I poured a month of my life into this and now it just got tagged over. But you can put the month of your life is still there in the print all the way. It shows up every time.
To kind of like zoom out a little bit more and talk about your practice from a little bit more of a bird's eye view, I think that sometimes people think about your practice is having these two sides. There's like these large, sometimes, years long, still ongoing community-based projects. And then there was this other side that was sort of personal narratives, often around trauma healing. And that always felt to me like it was likely a bit of a false dichotomy to say that these are the two things that she does and neither the twain shall meet. Because certainly community projects are healing in their own way. And when we heal ourselves, we're also healing a piece of the community that we're a part of. I don't know. Is this something that you find to be true?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you're kind of seeing is a trajectory where a tendency went from being unconscious to being conscious. So like when the earthquake struck Haiti in 2010 and a group of, a couple friends and I were like, okay, let's do something. Let's try to help in this moment. Or like in Braddock, when there was this community that was suffering tremendously in this kind of blight and economic collapse. And it was really having this very heavy effect on the entire community. This desire to, try to bring life and bring change, and all of these kind of tendencies, I think we're kind of functioning from the same place, which is like kind of a need to heal and a belief that creativity brings healing, because I was somebody, but at the time, when I first started those projects, I wasn't really kind of connecting the dots that I had grown up in a family that was heavily addicted to heroin and other drugs. They were, having psychotic episodes at times, ending up in jail and rehab and all different, disappearing, and so many things were happening that like a little kid shouldn't have to be living through. And I was the kid that kind of colored through the whole thing. My dad was like, something insane would be happening in the house. There'd be some chaos or fighting or something really terrifying would be happening. And I'd have he'd say I'd have a moment of clarity and go to look for you and be like, where are the kids? And he's like, I would look and you would just have your face turned toward the corner and you'd be coloring as though nothing was happening. And I was like, okay, like that was, I like just kind of made a safe bubble around my head and my imagination. And so I think when I was, starting the community-based work, I had an instinct from my upbringing that when things fall apart, that when there's a disaster, that when situations are untenable, that like, what do? Like, you get creative and you can, shift something. And so I did that work for years, but then my parents died kind of quite close to each other in pretty difficult ways. And it forced me to do a ton of like looking inward and healing. And when I did that, I was then started to deal with, the trauma of my upbringing. And I started to make those tendencies conscious and to be like, oh, this isn't, I didn't get this belief out of nowhere. Like I got this belief that creativity is a healing force because I lived with it. And the other thing that happened is that I think I have a little bit of a healthier relationship to the projects that I take on. Like when I was working in Haiti, I was giving all of my money. So I would fundraise, and then if we didn't fundraise the entire amount, I would just be like, that's fine. I don't need like health insurance or like a decent anything, like a new bike tire. Like I'll just give all my money to this project. And like we did beautiful things. It's not that I regret exactly doing that. It's just that now that I've become more conscious about my own self and my boundaries, I'm like, oh girl, that's codependent. Like, don't do that. Like, take care of yourself. Don't build a house for someone else. If your own house is collapsing, like fix your house and then help someone. and so kind of becoming more kind of working on my own healing. And of course, it's still a journey that I'm on like 100%. But there are some little things that I've gained, like the ability to take care of myself at the same time as trying to reach out and help build community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that, we see so often is this tendency to just say like, well, if I'm taking care of you, I don't need to think about me. And like, I can ignore kind of any of the chaos and the pain and the uncertainty that I'm feeling. And I can just like think about this person or this community. Yeah. Yeah. Listening to you tell your story, it makes me think about how I do think that, and granted, I've really only spent in-depth time in the art world. So this is something of just anecdotal evidence, but that, I do think that, trauma and addiction, you may find at higher rates in the art world and people who are drawn to creative practices. And I'm wondering if you have ever thought of art as kind of like somatic healing in a way, because it's such a physical undertaking, or at least a lot of it is. And I think about a therapist I had once who told me when I was if I felt like I was going to have a panic attack, I should throw a ball back and forth in front of my face. Yeah. Because if you have to use, the two sides of your body at the same time, it calms your brain down. And I'm like, oh, maybe, like carving a piece of linoleum or something can have that kind of same effect.
Yeah. I mean, I know I did a little bit of kind of therapeutic art work with folks in various, like some folks in rehab, for example. And I remember one woman just wanted to paint in these big circles. And I was like, yes, like you're getting your body involved. You're getting into your body in that way of it being kind of somatic. Or for me, the carving, honestly, what it felt like was that I had this maniacal energy. I had a lot of anger. I had all these forces in me that I didn't understand. And I was like, well, either they're going to push on me or I'm going to push them out, And so the carving and the endless hours and carving, it was like this feeling that I could take this driving force and just drive it back into the block. And so, yeah, I think very much that there was focus. There was like this, it's meditative, but also I think that you're right, that there is something about the being in the body and the driving, the pushing, all of that really had a power for me. And the other thing I think happens, I never like to use words like silver lining or something. I don't, in terms of trauma, I don't think of it exactly that way, but, or maybe I do, I don't know. But what I think happens, why I think you may see a lot of, kind of trauma and substance abuse within creative people is that what I found in myself and in my family is that trauma is a boundary violation. You don't get to say what's good, what's bad, what's safe, what's not. There's all these things you don't get to say when you're living in a chaos. And what that then also does, the kind of like silver lining there, is that you can be an unboundaried individual in ways that can also be beautiful. You can experience, like I would have these ecstatic experiences of the city when I first arrived. I think because of the ways in which I was able to be sort of permeable to the city itself. Or, I think in a sort of unboundaried mind, you can be like, yeah, we're going to do this. And then we're going to do that. And everyone's looking at you like you're crazy. And you're like, nah, it's good. We can do this, because you're making connections that other people aren't making, because you're like, I don't know, like it can be whatever. Like I know how far things can go in a bad way. And I also know where some possibilities are. And so, yeah, I think it's just one of those things where when you get people who are adapting beneficially, a lot of times those beneficial adaptations are creative adaptations.
Yeah, that's so good. And again, yeah, one hesitates to say things like silver lining or anything, because I feel like that almost puts like a kind of, almost sort of like a morality on the things that happen to us, when like the things that happen to us are just the things that happen to us, And I think that's one of the kind of sometimes disturbing, sometimes comforting things about trauma, is that sometimes there's not a reason. Sometimes it just happened. Yeah. And now you're standing on the other side and you're like, okay, here are the cards that I got dealt. What's my play?
And I just want to say that I've also seen, in my family, I've also seen like people sometimes, like you get fully taken apart. Like I definitely have some friends and family. I just want to sort of also honor that like there are people that don't necessarily, it's not that they don't live full lives, but it's not that it can fully break you down. That's all.
No, I think that's always significant to hear
it's
too.
Hard. Yeah. But but we are who we are, and we adapt, and also like what you were saying about, here's what I've been given. What's next for me? That very much feels like the creative process to me.
Yeah. So to speak a little bit about the particular exhibition that brought us together here today, Turner Carroll in Santa Fe, New Mexico, opening in just, I think, a week and some change.
Yeah.
And it's going to be of your new project, Cicada. What's the story of how that exhibition came to be and your introduction to that gallery?
Well, that is a really cool one, because Judy Chicago actually connected me with that gallery, and I've just felt so lucky over the last couple of years to be connected with her. Years ago, there was an idea came up for the two of us to show together, because she made a bunch of figurative work, and I make figurative work, and somehow this idea just came up, and she emailed me about the show. And I remember like that moment of like, oh my God, Judy Chicago just emailed me. And then for various reasons, that particular show didn't work out, but we stayed in touch. And I just want to say, this is a kind of a wild thing about her. Her mind, I like kind of can't keep up with her. Like we would, when we were kind of working on the show, we would be like, okay, let's read this book. And I would think we were going to call each other back in 3 weeks. And she would have read it like in 2 days. I was like, wait, what? Like amazing. So anyway, we stayed in touch. We ended up working on a project together called Create Art for Earth, which was that after she finished this project about mortality and extinction, she felt this like huge pull to kind of get a small, or whatever, not small, to get a kind of a movement going around ecological artwork. And so we worked together on that. And then she just said, hey, like, I want you to meet this gallery. And that's how we got connected. And this particular gallery, they're so, I don't know, just like loving and lovely. I'm really, this is my first show with them, but I've been kind of connected with them for about a year now. And it's just been such a joy, and I'm really excited. I'm going to visit, Judy when I'm out there. And we did a kind of a really fun thing together where they and I both helped present like a Lifetime Achievement Award to Judy over, during the pandemic, and had this really special moment where Judy was like, "You forgot to tell them that I call you my radical daughter, just like a nice Nan called me." And I was like, "Oh my God,"
oh my gosh.
just really, really, yeah. Yeah.
That's just a beautiful lineage and a beautiful story. I love that so much. And I'm so pleased to hear that you're enjoying working with them, because Jeffrey, who's the one who first introduced us, my life is just profoundly better from knowing him. Like he was
Wow.
just a beautiful mentor and friend to me when I was just a little wobbly-legged Bambi person in the art world in Seattle years ago. And so it feels really special that we get to all come together, and that you're working with him great. Because he's he'll do absolutely right by all the artists he works with. It's so amazing. Wonderful to see. Yeah.
That's absolutely the sense that I'm getting from them. Right now, we're working on bringing out this huge truck that I made as part of a project with PBS this winter. And if all goes well, we're actually this show's gonna have quite a few elements. So there's gonna be the kind of Hungworks show, and then there's the film Cicada, and then we may also bring the house our families built, which is this big box truck that unfolds into kind of a house-like sculpture full of portraiture and storytelling.
Is that the PBS truck, or is the house? Okay, gotcha. Yeah. So I was really curious, because we mentioned that in passing when we spoke before about this truck, and the kind of the power of storytelling. And I think it might be obvious to our dear listeners that someone who chooses to dedicate themselves to making a podcast might be someone who's pretty keen on the power of storytelling. But it's something that I've always loved. And so can you I know it may or may not end up in the show, but I'm really curious to hear what kind of form that actually takes in this project.
Well, with this project, it's actually a storytelling initiative that was launched by PBS, really out of the kind of incredible division that we've been experiencing or noticing, maybe to say, over the last 4 years. And so they wanted to do something to just get people talking to each other and to get people sharing just like elemental truths about who we are in our lives. And so they started this website, this huge website that's collecting like tens of thousands of stories, and it's called American Portrait. And then they wanted to engage it more deeply. And so they reached out to a few artists, one of them being me. And I was totally thrilled because I love storytelling, because public storytelling has been really life-changing for me. All the sort of work around trauma healing and all of that, the sort of the central component of that work has been public storytelling, and it has been about sharing my journey with people. And so when they said, we're working on the storytelling project, I was like, absolutely, I would love to be a part of this. And so I made a proposal, which was to create this sculpture that can move around and show up in different places, and that unfolds into a sort of an abstracted or I don't know what you would call it, more like an exploded sort of like a house home forms. And then during one iteration of it, we had a series of performances where actors, we sort of pieced together, my friend who's a playwright, Jeff Stark, pieced together various segments from the website where people were talking about kind of one of the main threads was food, and then another one of the main threads was intergenerational healing. And so we kind of, pieced together something which felt, not strictly narrative, but like they kind of hung together, and then created this performance that happened off the truck.
I love that connection between, food and intergenerational storytelling. And it's something that I feel like, a lot of America, a lot of the United States really is lacking in food culture. And I really feel like it misses out on a lot of elements of bonding that you see in other cultures. One of my dear friends who's actually helped out on the podcast a few times is Mexican American. And I remember her telling me this story of like when her family made tamales, that's when they could tell all the secrets. All the women would get together in the kitchen. And she said, you can tell the secrets that you normally wouldn't maybe, tell your mom, like, the guy that you're seeing or, something like that. And then the secrets go in the tamales and then you don't have to talk about them, but you can like, and I just was like, oh, how different would have my relationships maybe have been if I'd had that. So they're beautifully connected.
Yeah. And there's something about, we see this also in art making. One of my favorite collaborators is Philly Mural Arts. And they have a very similar kind of philosophy about these large scale murals that they make, where they make them on fabric so you can spread them out on a table. And then you can get 10, 20, people in a room together working, painting side by side. And depending on this, sometimes if the mural has a specific subject to it, let's say like crime and, survivors and affected families and, something where there needs to be a conflict resolution. They said if you get people just painting side by side, even people who think that they hate each other at first, something about the act of doing this third thing, it kind of takes your attention away, you're involved in something else, and then these other conversations start to be able to emerge because you're focused not on each other, but on the thing you're creating together. And you have time and you have this kind of this intimacy that's created, and then all these really profound conversations, or the telling of the secrets or whatever kind of comes out of that.
Yeah, and it's just such important work right now because the divisions that, as you said, were either have sort of coming to the surface, maybe is a good way of putting them. They're really scary and really powerful. And I think it comes from separation and separation of the media we consume, separation of the way we interact socially. And it doesn't really actually usually take that long when you just put two people together working towards something for that animosity to kind of start to splinter a little bit, I think, because there are extreme cases of people who have, very genuine issues with other people, but average human can sit across from someone at a table and see the other person as just another human. And, we've only gotten more isolated, I think, unfortunately, during the pandemic too. Yeah.
And I think like I think a certain kind of radical compassion is the only thing that's going to like ultimately start to mend us. Like it feels like things get so splintered and so argumentative that it gets, that I sort of start to look at this lens of like that level of compassion where you can say it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. And I mean that literally. I'm going to see the human being in you. And that's something that I try to keep sight of. It's certainly not easy at all, but I think if there's one thread that I try to keep consistent in my work, it's this like attempt to look at that part of people. It feels like this kind of little light in the center that if you're like, just keep your eye on that. And, in that, I guess, is their basic humanity, where you can say like, I literally don't care what you've done in your life. I am just going to stare straight into your humanity and focus on that and hope that by focusing on that is what amplifies between us.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it's one of the phrases that I use that I think I picked up in hippie high school days from the Dalai Lama, but it still slaps.
That guy, sure,
totally. I am a human being who wants to be free of suffering, and you are a human being who wants to be free of suffering.
Yes.
And it's
exactly.
This is true, Yeah. I feel like this is a nice sort of transition to talk about some of the portraits in your work, talking about seeing that kind of radical humanity. Because you have these, you have installations, you've got this like folding out truck, and then you also have this series of just beautiful, intimate, pretty just classically traditional portraits of your close friends. How do they sort of fit into the whole project?
Well, the portraits are, it's kind of a series. Let me see. There's sort of a lot is going on, I think, in those portraits.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from my close friends to also street portraits to portraits of people that I've worked with, on projects where I was working in the prison system or working in rehabilitation facilities or with addicted folks out on the street. So there's a lot of different ways that people are showing up in these portraits. But I think that it's actually, the show is actually called Wholeness in Mind, because I'm sort of thinking about that, not only like how we find our wholeness, but I think that thing I was just saying earlier about like the little light, how if you focus on that and that can grow, that in itself is a wholeness that we all possess, that we all always possess an unbroken wholeness that can become very much obstructed, but which we can always reconnect back to. And so I think that the sort of act of looking at people for me is always just kind of a loving act that I just find people infinitely, I don't know. I can look at them forever. I don't even know what. But yeah, so that's, I think, the core of all of this work is the portraits, and is looking at other humans and kind of hoping that a certain kind of loving looking is the thing that can amplify. Have you ever read John Berger's essays on, I think the book is called The Shape of a Pocket?
No.
He has these two beautiful essays that just absolutely, I read them every year. And one is about Van Gogh, and the other is about, I'm forgetting the name of the painter now, but these paintings that he made in the asylums of Paris. And the essays are so beautiful, and they just kind of talk about what it means to give a certain kind of attention to something. And so, yeah, I think that that's like how I think about portraits, is I guess I think that like consciousness is kind of magic, right? Where we direct our consciousness, like it really is. Like we understand so little about it. It's like very magical.
Yeah.
And where we direct our consciousness has a power.
Yep.
And I think like the older I get, the longer I live, the more that I believe that, like, I think when I was younger, I used to be like, maybe you can imbue intention into form. And now I'm like, yeah, no, I think you can. Like, I think you can. I think that a sort of a dedicated looking and like a loving exploration of another human can truly be captured and show up on a piece of paper.
It's that old artworks have an aura about them that is that kind of comes from that focused attention that, as you say, the artist imbues into it. And I read the work and it just sort of felt right. And then I had this experience where I was doing my master's degree. I was studying prints. I was absolutely in love with everything Albrechter had touched. And I was really excited to go see the watercolor of the young hare that I knew the Albertina had, when I was in Vienna. And I was kind of had planned my whole trip around going to see it. I just loved the piece. And I'd been, having my grand tour through Europe and like having these deeply emotional experiences, just shaking and crying in Giotto's cathedral, just having these deeply like bodily reactions. And when I finally saw this young hare, I didn't feel anything. And I was so confused. But when I went back, to Arizona where I was doing my graduate work, and I ran into my advisor and I was telling her about my summer and, saying how I went to see the young hare. And she was like, oh, but yeah, you didn't really see it though. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, Miranda, they wouldn't have had a 400-year-old watercolor just out on display. Like, she's like, you definitely saw a reproduction. And I was like, that's it. It's real. Like, that was like my experience.
How cool.
Yeah. I was like, this is real. Like the aura of works of art. And,
it's beautiful.
And so I love what you're saying about connecting that to humans. And I know that, there's all kinds of Buddhist traditions of just meditating on loving kindness for someone. And that this is, by that belief system, this isn't just random thoughts. Like you are doing work for that person. Like it is fully believed that like you are going to help them. I mean, it's just, it's what prayer is across the millennia that humans have been doing that. It's all a part of it. Yeah.
I think of it also, maybe I said this already, but I sort of think of it as like, if you can see the inner wholeness of someone, whether or not they can see it, that if you can see it and show it, like, what happens? So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. Well, in the time that we have left, I'd love it to chat a little bit about the video element of this exhibition, these beautiful stop motion films that you've done, and sort of how you came to that and what you're finding you're able to tell through that format that maybe you haven't been able to tell before.
Yeah, I'm like in a very radical shift in my life at the moment. It's really something is happening. I am really I'm actually moving toward narrative filmmaking, which is, I don't know why, but it just feels very shocking to me.
Yeah.
But a couple of years ago, I was doing one of those things where you like kind of write down your life and your goals and your this and your whatever. And I came up with like how much I really wanted to make animation, and that I wasn't doing it, and I kept not doing it. And it was the first time that I realized, I was like, oh, I'm going to have to stop doing something else if I'm ever going to make space for this dream that I keep having and I keep putting aside. And so that's why I was saying I actually stopped making prints. So the whole series, I'm still kind of creating a few last permutations of those, but the whole kind of body of prints that went out on the streets has ended, and now I have shifted to making time-based work and to making film. And so the first thing I did was spend a couple of summers just secluding myself and just teaching myself this medium. And I fell in love with it immediately. It's one of those things that I wanted to do it when I was 20, but I didn't. That was, then 20 years later, I picked it back up, and it was kind of astonishing how much I had needed to learn from, in those 20 years, and how much I had learned about building stories visually, and, even just building sculptures and objects, and having confidence in your creative experimental voice, and all these different things. And also how to continue to link things together even when they feel disparate. Like all of those lessons kind of needed to accrue. And then I think I also just needed to get deeper into my unconscious in a conscious way, which is the thing, we talked about therapy and working through trauma and making a conscious connection to your unconscious so that you can start to have this conversation unfold within the work. And you can start to kind of steer it, a little like lucid dreaming or something. And so that's like what Cicada is. It's a little bit of a lucid dream in paper and in stop motion animation. And it centers around transformation, and the tarantula mother, like you mentioned before, comes up and is a very prominent figure, and is, about fear, and is about confronting the unconscious. And there's, quite a few sort of metaphors about, the descent of Persephone and cicadas going underground, and the, sort of trip, journey into the kind of barrenness of parts of the unconscious that we have cut ourselves off from. And then also just like a lot of play, because it's like a very playful medium.
Yeah. I think that it's, been described by, other writers and reviewers as having a kind of lightness about it, that kind of a trip to the moon, that like silent film kind of feel.
Oh, I love that era. I really love that era. Just the invention of cinema. I mean, it was magic. And like Georges Méliès was he was a stage magician, the person who made a trip to the moon. So there's this beautiful lightness and fun and inventiveness and very outward reaching, when you're a stage musician and you're trying to reach an audience. And I absolutely love that era, and very much have kind of tapped into that era for this work. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that people don't realize about silent films is that they're so good. Like they're so good, and they're so funny, and they're so like the actors are so talented. The way they use their faces, and it's just, it's incredible. And it's just such a beautiful and kind of exciting time. And then also, there's all kinds of like risque things in it, because this is, like films being censored had to be invented, Yes. So I feel like we're coming up on the hour recording mark here. So yeah, I think I just want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me. It's been just wonderful, and to thank you for all the good work that you do. I'm so pleased that you're out in the world doing what you do. I know we're all better for it.
Oh, amazing. Well, it's been super fun, and I've really appreciated just the different kinds of, conversation that you've been able to open up. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's our show for this week. But if you're looking for a bit more inky conversation to be had, be sure to check out the Patreon page and hear extra studio and professional advice from Callie in this week's free episode of Shop Talk with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. Join me again next week when my guest will be Alexander Landerman. We'll talk about growing up rurally, the art of fixing things, and the importance of having a mentor. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.